Hi, I'm Naomi Francis-Parker, and this is SEO in 2024 Additional Insights.
Naomi, what's your additional insight for SEO in 2024?
Utilize your internal data to get the most out of what your customers truly want, rather than focusing on data everywhere on the internet.
Okay, so there is potentially a lot of internal data. What internal data should you be using?
Specifically, any data that your customer services team have in terms of complaints, but also compliment. What are your customers saying about, this is mainly for e-commerce websites, but what are they saying about your products or your service, that you can then take that and put that onto your website to help future customers?
Okay, the two C's, complaints and compliments. So I like that. It gives you something to focus on. But how do you go about collecting that data and then making sense of the data to do something with from an SEO perspective?
A lot of it is, it sounds cliche, but communication. There are so many businesses where the SEO team or the marketing team won't ever speak to the sales team or the customer service team. So there's a really big disconnect, because the sales and the customer services teams will know really in depth what customers want, what they ask, the general pain points or things they really like about something. But that's already translated through to the marketing team, who are actually meant to be marketing the product or the service. So communication is the main thing, just asking. And then the other side of it, a more practical side, I would say, would be for e-commerce websites, but also for service-based websites, making sure you have FAQs and content around those complaints and compliments to educate your audience as much as possible.
Okay, I knew there had to be a third C, communication, in there, so it's better with three. And in terms of how this applies to agencies, so if you're an agency that's acting on behalf of a client, how do you try to ensure that you get all this information? Because it can be harder sometimes to have conversations with people who are actively involved with customer service or other roles like that.
Yeah, definitely. There are several ways you can do it. Things that I've always done in my role is I just ask the question. So when we start with a client and we start doing their strategy and we know, okay, they want to focus on these products or these services, any questions that I have as a potential customer, I send them on and say, hey, can you answer these questions for me? Or can you give me some more information around X, Y, Z? Because I see this on the website, but I don't know much about it. Because at the end of the day, we're all consumers. So if I'm thinking that, and then other people in the team are thinking that, it's very likely that that business's customer will be thinking that. And also, I think agencies should have, as part of that onboarding, a good questionnaire or something that asks kind of key questions that, and you can make them quite generic, but key questions around their best-selling products. They can give you a list, and then you can say, okay, why are they best-selling? What do your customers say? So just a lot of data gathering, but a questionnaire is quite a nice, easy thing you can send out during the onboarding phase.
And then do you also apply another layer, another filter on top of consistent complaints that you hear? Because, just because customers have an issue with something doesn't necessarily mean it should be something that the business should be focusing on.
Absolutely. A lot of the time when there are complaints, it might just be that there's a lack of education for the customer on that product or service. And then there are also complaints that are just kind of complaints for the sake of it that you can ignore. But when it comes to a lack of understanding, or maybe there wasn't enough information when the customer bought it and then it arrived and it didn't quite meet the expectations, all of that information is information that you can use to then put on the website. So could it be, if you sell backpacks, for example, and you find a lot of people complain because they have a 16-inch laptop that doesn't fit, well, then maybe you need to add specs to the website. Or if you have that, maybe you need to add a comparison video with some of your other bags, things like that. So it can then translate quite easily into wider, I suppose, SEO-focused work.
And a lot of these conversations with customers sound fairly intangible. So are there any systems and tools that you use that you'd like to recommend to help to define what you're hearing?
I definitely think when it comes to, this is kind of wider business tool stack, I suppose, but definitely some kind of program where your customer service calls are being recorded, and then that data and the keywords that they use in those calls can then be gathered. So for example, if we just use the backpack example, if you keep seeing that people keep using small or too big or things like that, there are really good tools that you can use to gather that data and then turn it into a data set, which then can be passed on to various teams.
And are there any specific tools that you can recommend? Because hearing you say that, it immediately makes me think, well, you can use AI to generate the transcripts, and you can also use AI to look at that transcript and then summarize it and collate the most repeated points from that transcript.
Definitely. One that I've used in the past is Ruler Analytics. So that's a really good one because it gives you a whole dashboard, and it does utilize AI to pick up on the keywords or frequent words that are used in a conversation when people are talking to your customer services team. And then also it can collate additional information about that user. So where they're calling from, all of that kind of stuff. So that's one that I've used the most. But absolutely, especially now, there'll be so many kind of AI focused tools that you can use to download the transcripts, or even just to sift through the transcripts and say, hey, can you give me a summary of this complaint or compliment or whatever it was, to figure out, okay, what are the key things?
Great. Yeah, Ruler Analytics. I haven't heard of that one before. That's just ruleranalytics.com. And I can see, looking at their website, that you can integrate their platform with Google Analytics, AdWords, Facebook ads, so other regularly used platforms.
Yeah, it's really, really good. Definitely recommended.
Now, something you also shared to begin with was that you should be using your own experience to deal with what you find. So what experience is that, and how do you know if you've got the right experience?
So I'll answer that question from agency side, but then also as part of a business in-house. Agency side, so if I'm thinking about me, the experience that I can, or that the agency can bring, can be like the SEO marketing benefits to, you've got all these questions around this product. How do we then translate that onto the website to actually help future users to boost sales? So then that's where it comes down to your content, your on-page FAQs, things like that, pictures, all kind of the standard on-page things. And then also cross-referencing with keyword research to see if there's anything else that you can use to enhance that. And then on the kind of in-house side, if you are part of a brand, you should intrinsically understand your product probably better than anybody else, even better than your customers. So many business owners, but even people that are in marketing or sales, underestimate how much experience and expertise they have around a product because it's their bread and butter. But I've spoken to so many business owners and people working within a business where I'll ask them questions and they'll say, oh, well, I just thought everyone knew that. And most of the time they don't know that. So all the things that you get asked frequently and all the things that you kind of take for granted as an advanced user of a product or a service, that's your experience. So it's a bit intangible, but I think that's where businesses can pitch themselves against competitors, because it's going to be more about these unique insights going forward.
And how do you decide upon the right thing to do in order to serve that customer issue, that customer complaint? Because it could be that they simply need to be made aware of what the business actually currently does. It could be a product requirement to the product team for the future. And it could be something that's resolved, I guess, by some training, maybe a video or blog article. So there are many different solutions that you could provide.
I think it's a mix of everything, to be honest. I think especially now, and looking at the future of how SEO and just marketing in general is moving, I think all of those touch points are really important. So you could start, if you were looking at it practically and you're like, okay, there are all of these options, what do we go with first? First port of call, just make sure your product page is as informative as possible, because if people are on that page, sometimes they just need one question answered before they can make a purchase, which is perfect. That's what you want. And then beyond that, you want to make sure you have supporting guides and content. And then when you have all of that, if you're still having some tension or if things aren't quite explained in the way that you want, then webinars and even just videos going through and tangibly showing a product can make such a difference.
And from an SEO perspective, how do you actually measure the success of what you've done in order to serve the gap that you've found? Because you talked about maybe doing a webinar or a piece of content to make a customer or a potential customer more satisfied? Is it just conversion rates that you look at?
It's a mix. So if we're looking at content, for example, depending on if it's purely informational, top of the funnel, then engagement rates, click-through rates as well. But then if you're looking at the more commercial kind of content, so for example, if someone just knows they want a product but they need a bit more information, then you can tie revenue back to content that you produce on your blog if it's very product and commercial heavy. And this is something that has been quite successful. I think some people believe that content just doesn't convert, but that's not necessarily true for content that sits further down the funnel. So if you really do your research and also look at competitors as well, and if you have a competitor that's absolutely nailing a space from a content perspective and a perceived sales perspective, have a look at what they're doing and see if there's anything that you can tweak with your own content to improve that.
So you talked about engagement and click-through rate. Is there any measurable SEO impact, such as ranking increases, that you've actually discovered as a result of doing that?
100%. So when you have your data set, say, you know that people want more information about some backpacks that you sell, have a look, as in addition to your own kind of customer data, there will absolutely be search around these topics. And so this is where you need to do keyword research, but perhaps looking at the more informational keywords. So it wouldn't just be black backpack. It would be more, what's the best backpack size for a 16-inch laptop, for example, things like that. So you can build content around these more informational terms. And then that's when it comes down to your rankings and then your visibility. So Search Console would be probably the best for this, because you should be able to visibly see your impressions and clicks go up for these more informational terms, and then how that translates through to the rest of the pages.
And bring it to AI again. Are you attempting to rank these long tail terms for AI-driven answers?
It depends. So I think first and foremost, you should focus on the customer, but I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. In the same way as you would optimize for feature snippets, definitely make sure that content is digestible for, SGE when that comes around for us in the UK, and more AI generated features. But I think that would come naturally anyway, just in the way that you answer your questions, especially if you're answering FAQs that don't require a bunch of text. Sometimes it might just be not even a paragraph or two, a line or two. So a bit of both.
And you also mentioned some competitors may be knocking it out of the park from a content perspective. How do you know that that's what's happening?
So generally, you'll just, once you have your keywords, just Google them. I think there's a lot to be said for just Googling some of your top keywords on the informational side and just seeing, okay, who's coming up top and why. 9 times out of 10, they're probably going to be people you're already aware of. Especially, I work a lot in the e-commerce space, and generally it's the brands that we expect to see up there. And so then it's like, okay, why and what are they doing and what kind of content is ranking? Is it their product page that's ranking? Or is there something that's ranking that we could do a better version of, or is actually more relevant? We could produce a more relevant piece of content or asset, whatever it might be. And then using tools as well, just to see what they're ranking for.
And do you attempt to guesstimate how much success competitors are getting in terms of click-through rates and traffic to their website and what's happening to that traffic? Or is it more an intuitive response that you need to build?
I would say guesstimate to a point, but I think rather than focusing solely on what they're doing and then trying to copy, I think have a good idea of, right, they're doing really, really well. I can see why. This is where the expertise will come in, especially if you're working from the SEO point of view. You'll know if their on page is better than your on page, for example. But then once you have that information, try and translate it into the brand, your brand, or the brand that you're working on, because I think it's very easy to just do a copy and think, oh, that's going to work. But especially with AI and EEAT and all of that, I think you need to kind of not stay in your lane, but you need to focus on your brand or how your brand can take that insight and then translate it into something that feels right for you.
Brilliant. You've shared what SEO should be doing in 2024. Now let's talk about what SEO shouldn't be doing. So what's something that's seductive in terms of time, but ultimately counterproductive? What's something that SEO shouldn't be doing in 2024?
I think, and this may be controversial, but I think SEOs should focus less on keyword difficulty and keyword volume and actually look at whether that keyword is relevant. Because you may have keywords that have a ridiculous amount of search volume. Obviously, you can go after those as well, but then a lot of people ignore the keywords that don't have much search volume at all, but then it's incredibly relevant for your brand or your product. I would say it doesn't make sense to discount it or really delve into, well, the difficulty is this, but the search volume is this, so what should we do? If it makes sense, it makes sense. And then you'll know sooner or later whether or not you need to up the ante or if you need to add in other keywords. So yeah.
And does it make sense to go after zero volume keywords?
I think if it's completely relevant to your product or your service and you know that that is how your customers describe your products, I think absolutely. And also, we can't ignore emerging trends as well. There is so much new terminology, especially with social media, where there may be zero volume now, but give it 3-6 months, it might be a really good keyword. So yeah, if it's relevant, I would focus on it.
Naomi Francis-Parker is head of SEO at The Evergreen Agency, and you can find her over at theevergreenagency.co.uk. Naomi, thanks so much for adding your additional insight to SEO in 2024.
Thank you so much.
I've been your host, David Bain. You've been listening to an episode of SEO in 2024 Additional Insights, a Majestic series that complements the original SEO in 2024 podcast, video series, and book. Find out more at SEOin2024.com.